It is a great pleasure for me today to introduce Dr. George Griener. It seems like a number of you, the students among you, or many of you know him already, who is Professor Emeritus at the Jesuit School of Theology and chair of its Climate Justice Committee. Dr. Griener has a very compelling presentation on this important topic of climate justice to share with us today. After his presentation, we'll have a brief amount of time to exchange ideas and ask Dr. Griener questions. But without further ado, I want to thank you, Professor Griener, for being with us and for sharing this with us, and ask you to take it away.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is an opportunity. Okay, this is very consonant with the goals of the Graduate Theological Union. Sort of an ecumenical, interreligious discussion of an issue that faces all of us. I'm very happy to be here for this. I'm going to try to get my PowerPoint properly chosen. I think this is it. Let me see if that's the case. Yeah, yes, it is. Okay. So what I'd like to do is do this presentation on what I say faith perspectives on climate change. And the reason for that, as you'll see, it unfolds. This has engaged many of the religious traditions so far in the last few years. For the Roman Catholics, I'll just give a little background. Back in 1960, there was a Second Vatican Council. For 100 years following the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the church had been sort of at odds with the rest of the world, and didn't want to come to terms with modernity. But in 1965, this document, Gaudium et Spes, was published, and there's a very fascinating opening line. The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who were poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in the hearts. That stance, in a certain sense, gives the underlying ethos for the Christian or Roman Catholic approach to the question of climate change. And just what are those griefs and anxieties? We talked about some of them last night. Some of them would be climate change, which has been leading to flooding. Bangladesh, Australia, New York City, Cambodia, Uganda, Japan, Venice, the Philippines, even South Beach, Florida. Moreover, there has been the drought has been leading to desertification, where the land turns to desert. So we have India, Rwanda. I think last night Alice spoke about Rwanda. Well, there's an example of the drought hitting Rwanda, Iran, Kenya, even in Amboy, California, Ethiopia, a significant impact to people worldwide, which can be attributed in many ways to climate change. There is also what we know very well here in California, the forest fires, but they occurred recently in Spain, Australia, Indonesia, and many other parts of the world. Really a devastating response to rising temperatures, where the woodlands dry out, and then they become more susceptible to fire. Yesterday, was mentioning the dust storm in Korea. The dust blows in from the dry deserts of China and Mongolia. And that happens, I was there many years ago in Seoul, and they had to cancel schools and cancel airline flights, and you could feel the dust in your teeth because it blows across the Yellow Sea over Korea, and then it impacts the country. Breathing, in fact, every dimension of life is impacted by that. So the dust you see there actually is from China and Mongolia. Just a little perspective, by 2100, more than 8 out of every 10 people on Earth will live in Asia or Africa. It's helpful for us who live in the West or European and North American to realize that we're the minority. We're the very small minority on the planet now. And the population is really shifting. So just to keep that in perspective, because sometimes we think of ourselves, but 8 out of 10 people will be living in Asia or Africa. The World Economic Forum issued a global risks report on January 19th, and it opened with, getting the world to focus on climate change is a huge challenge. The history of climate policy is littered with false starts and missed opportunities. There's a window of opportunity now. Being proactive about this disruption must be an integral part of the world's climate change strategy. So this is just a couple months ago, the World Economic Forum. And about 2 weeks ago, the director of the National Intelligence issued a document on global trends through 2040. And one of the points they made was during the next 20 years, the physical effects from climate change of higher temperatures, sea level rise, extreme weather will impact every country, and the costs and challenges will fall disproportionately on the developing world, intersecting with degradation to intensify risks to food. So globally, more and more national organizations and our own country are becoming aware of the serious nature of this. This is the background. Well, what is it that prompts religious attention to the climate? And I suggest there are at least 6 points that I would like to sort of underscore. One is the interconnectedness of the entire created order. 2, human beings are embedded in an evolving cosmos. 3, we need an inclusive ecological spirituality, one that really takes seriously the world we live in as part of our spiritual understanding of ourselves. Beginning with the Neoplatonists in the early part of the Christian era, your Platonists and the Middle Platonists, Christianity tended to become somewhat dualistic, kind of separating body and spirit. That kind of entered through the Greeks, and we're still wrestling with that kind of dualism. The recognition of climate impact on the most vulnerable is the 4th point I'd like to underscore. Then intergenerational justice and responsibility. And finally, the need for new economic models. Now, I say this prompts religious attention to the climate in many areas. For example, there has been a Buddhist Catholic dialogue on climate change. There is a UN environment program, Faith for Earth, which brings religious communities together kind of globally. There is a Parliament of the World's Religion beginning to attack the question of climate action. There is a booklet that can be accessed on that link. I'll make this whole PowerPoint available if you want to look at it. There are a number of links to outside sources that would be too much to put in this particular text. The Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology is an international multi-religious project contributing to a new academic field, really, and an engaged moral force of religious environmentalism. So this link to the Yale Forum is very helpful. They send out a weekly bulletin update. They're talking about global issues in science, policy, law, economics. It's a very helpful source, and Yale University maintains that as a kind of a connection for a wide variety of organizations. Islam is very concerned about this. There is an Islamic statement on climate change issued back in August 2015. Here in the United States, there is a considerable movement grounded in the Abrahamic tradition. The Quran presents a harmonious view of nature reminiscent of the Far East. In fact, the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, share many ethical overlapping concerns about the environment. That's Islam, but you can also turn to Buddhism. Once again, in 2015, Buddhists issued a climate change statement available through that link if you want to access it from the PowerPoint. The founding premise of One Earth Sangha is that the Buddhist tradition offers significant, largely untapped resources that can support in bringing wisdom, compassion, courage, creativity, flexibility, and a steady resolve to our interrelated ecological crises. Hinduism also moves in this direction. It was a statement of the Hindu community in 2015. This is an example of one here, Brahma Kumaris Environmental Initiative. Living with simplicity, buying compassionately, using economically, learning continuously, sharing generously. And again, this document is available if you access that link, if you're interested, if you download the PowerPoint. It's just too complicated to do it online from here. The Jewish community, the Jewish rabbinic letter on climate change from 2015. While we struggle to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, we cannot afford to ignore the ongoing climate crisis. Jewish tradition teaches that we humans are a single family, all related by common tradition and descent, creation and descent, that we have responsibilities for the well-being of others. And finally, when it turns to Christianity, we have a variety of initiatives, Presbyterians for earth care, God, creation, and climate change, which is the Lutheran movement. The Episcopal Church community is care of creation. There's a Methodist movement that had a webinar just a few weeks ago in February. Eco-Jesuit is a global group of Jesuits worldwide worrying about climate. And then here in the United States, there's the Catholic Climate Covenant, care for creation, care for the poor. So there's widespread religious concern about the question of climate change. It is not simply the product of a marginal group and one religious tradition. It is widespread. I had mentioned that the interconnectedness of the cosmic order is the first point that I would like to address. This is really more than the product of scientific investigation. It is a religious insight which reaches beyond empirical evidence. It really goes beyond the evidence itself, but it is nevertheless presuppose of all scientific inquiry. If we didn't think things were connected, there would really be little point in trying to do scientific inquiry. And this religious insight is expressed in mythic form in all the creation stories of the world's religions. The Enuma Elish, Popol Vuh in Guatemala, Gilgamesh, Pangu, and the two Genesis accounts, which are common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're familiar with them, but I'd just like to underscore them. God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation, every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth, every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree." God saw that it was good. Evening came and morning followed the third day. What I find interesting about Genesis, nevertheless, is after the flood, the famous flood that Noah was involved in, there is another covenant established. And Genesis reports this: God said to Noah and to his sons, "I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, all the birds and the various tame and wild animals that were with you and came out of the ark. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all bodily creatures be destroyed by the waters of a flood." Now, that captures the religious insight of the unity of the covenant that God had, not just with human beings, but with the created order. It's captured, for example, in Isaiah: "I will create a new heaven, a new earth. The former will not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice for forever in what I create." And then that's picked up in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, the Apocalypse. "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Then I, John, saw this New Jerusalem." Most Christian communities share the Nicene Creed that was drawn up in 325, East and West, Protestant and Catholic, and it begins very directly: "We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen." It's the way most Christians, when they recite the creed, begin. It's a statement about the created order. Joseph Cardijn was a Belgian cardinal, and he developed a circle of moral discernment. It was see, judge, and act. And then look again at what you've done. Check again. See, there's a cycle of seeing, judging, and acting. So it's responding to what we see around us. One of the figures who was very important in North America was Rachel Carlson. Back in 1907, back in 1960, she wrote a great book, Silent Spring. She had been interested in the environment, especially the impact of pesticides on the environment, but her work, Silent Spring, brought the environmental concerns related to the American public. Now that's almost 50 years ago now, 60 years ago. And it led to the development of the US Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. So her book was really a source of attention to this issue. And then some of us old enough to remember on Christmas Eve, 1968, one of the astronauts turned the camera back towards the Earth from circling the moon, and this photograph of the Earth in the distance with the moon in the foreground gave, I think, most of us on Earth a new perspective of the Earth as located in a larger cosmos. We suddenly saw how fragile it was. And since then, the Hubble telescope and other images have just kind of expanded our appreciation for the world that we see outside ourselves. It's helpful sometimes to remind that Berkeley is not the end of the Earth. The most comprehensive Roman Catholic treatment of climate change took place on a document entitled Laudato Si, on care for our common home. Pope Francis dated the document 24th of May, 2015, but he released it very tellingly on the first day of Ramadan in that year, which was June the 18th. And the reason he did that is he had been in conversation with heads of other religious communities about the upcoming Paris Climate Conference that would be taking place in December of 2015. So he released this document as a comprehensive position statement of the Roman Catholic Church, but invited other traditions to become involved in this conversation in view of what was about to happen in Paris, namely a UN discussion on climate. There'll be more discussion of this tomorrow, a very comprehensive treatment of this. So I'm just going to kind of sketch very briefly the chapter sections. The opening chapter is what is happening to our common home. Chapter 2 is the gospel of creation. Chapter 3 is the human roots of the ecological crisis. He says it would hardly be helpful to describe symptoms without acknowledging the human origins of the crisis. A certain way of understanding human life and activity has gone awry to the detriment of the world. Then he speaks of integral ecology, not just ecology out there, but involving all of us. It's helpful to move away from thinking of ourselves as visitors at a zoo and to realize we're part of the zoo. We're part of the environment. We're not just visitors to the planet. Then he has lines of approach and action, trying to find a way to see if there isn't a way of reimagining how to deal with the world we live in, a change of direction, courses of action. And then what he speaks of as ecological education and spirituality. It's not just educating about the world, educating the people about the world and ourselves, but really appropriating a spirituality which includes that. We sometimes think of salvation as touching only our souls and save your soul. Well, salvation is bigger than that. The word became flesh, okay. Now, Laudato Si draws on prior statements of Catholic bishops' conferences worldwide. That is, starting back in Brazil in 1992, Paraguay in 93, Philippines in 98, South Africa 99, Canada 2003, Germany in 2006, Argentina in 9. Catholic bishops' conferences worldwide had already begun to address this. They were issuing pastoral letters for their own regional churches, Paraguay, New Zealand, Germany, addressing the question of climate change. And what Francis does is draw on those documents. So in many ways, Laudato Si represents a worldwide consensus of official Catholic thought on the climate. But more than 50 years ago, ecology had already become a theme which Roman Catholic officials tackled. 1971, which is 50 years ago, Paul VI addressed the ecological issue as a crisis. We are suddenly becoming aware that by an ill-considered exploitation of nature, we risk destroying it, becoming in our own turn the victim. And that echoed 8 years later by John Paul II, warning the exploitation of the earth, not only for industrial, but for military purposes, brings a threat to our natural environment. So beginning 50 years ago, Roman Catholic leaders were already fully engaged in the conversation. And what we saw in 2015 was, in a certain sense, the summation of a long developing tradition on the question. This will be spelled out more tomorrow in the presentation on this document alone. Benedict is considered the first green pontiff. He installed solar panels on the Vatican roof. So a Pope who is thinking beyond just the baptismal font and the communion rail, he's thinking about how to deal with addressing climate change and reducing the fossil footprint of the Vatican in Rome. In September of 2015, Pope Francis came to the US and spoke at the United Nations specifically about climate change. That was the topic of his address. And once again, it occurred before this December 2015 climate change summit. And he said some very interesting things. He says, it must be stated that a true right of the environment does exist. That is a right of the environment for two reasons. Because we human beings are part of the environment. We live in communion with it. We're part of that ecosystem. And secondly, and this is a theological assertion, every creature, particularly a living creature, has an intrinsic value. That is, it's not a value only in terms of its use by human beings. It has an intrinsic value in its existence, its life, its beauty, and its interdependence with other creatures. We become a very utilitarian people, and we imagine the world around us is there for our use. Well, what the Pope is arguing here is that every creature has an intrinsic value, its own beauty, and interdependence with other creatures. Then in 2019, Pope Francis held a synod of bishops that is usually held for some religious reason on a recurring basis. This time the issue was the Amazon. The focus of attention of this religious gathering was on the Amazon region, its peoples, its cultures, its land, and the environment being damaged by that. It took place from October 6th to the 27th in 2019, a religious body addressing not just a theological question, but a region of the earth, namely the Amazon. And here he is with some of the indigenous participants at the synod. They were invited to come from the Amazon to Rome, and they didn't have a vote, but they did have voice in the conversation that was taking place in the discussions. Now, I present this because sometimes we learn geography when I went to school. This isn't always the case for everybody today. So we want to look at the Amazon region. It contains about 20% of the Earth's fresh water. It contains about 40% of the flora and fauna of the Earth. And it contains about 1/3 of the planet's primary forests. So this Amazon region right here was the focus of attention of this assembly of bishops in Rome to treat the issues that are unfolding there as a religious issue. Amazon fires have increased, according to the Space Agency's photography and satellites, by 84% in 1 year. What is happening here is land is being cleared, mainly for grazing, raising corn or alfalfa, and soy to raise crops. So the forests continue to burn in the, and this is in Brazil. This is the Brazilian part of the Amazon. The synod working document begins with a specific geographical area to build a bridge to other important biomes of the world: the Congo Basin, the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, the tropical forests of the Asia-Pacific region, and the Guarani Aquifer, among many others. And in case those aren't part of your everyday conversation, this is sort of a map of these principal rainforests. We have the Amazon. We just talked about the Amazon. The Congo Basin is this region over here. You have the Guarani Aquifer along the eastern coast of South America. The Mesoamerican corridor running from kind of lower part of Mexico down to the Isthmus of Panama. And then we have the Asian Pacific forests over in this region. All of them are threatened by use and abuse. And they remain, as I say, the source of the production of oxygen, fresh water, and many animal forms. The Congo Basin is the second largest river. It's the second largest rainforest. And it is projected that by 2100, 100% of the rainforest could be lost. There is a lot of oil production taking place in this area. So one of the issues tends also to be pollution by oil manufacture. This is also true in Nigeria. The Guarani Aquifer, which is down here in the southern part of this map, has a volume of about 40,000 cubic kilometers, a thickness of maybe 50 meters deep, 160 feet, and a maximum depth of about just under 6,000 feet. And it probably contains about 37,000 cubic kilometers of water, an enormous reservoir of water. And of course, we share the environment with all of these animals. These are all cuddly little animals. I'm not talking about the grizzlies or the brown bears, but we do share this. I make it a habit of mine to go for a walk every morning up there in the hills behind the University of California campus. I want to see the deer. I want to see the plant life. I want to smell the trees. I want to actually be in touch with nature, so it makes an impact, not just a cognitive impact in my left brain, but it makes an affective impact on me as well. I try to avoid the skunks. The Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, this is part of the Greek-speaking church, visited the rainforest in 2006. This is him in the foreground. And he is also referred to as the Green Patriarch. Now, this is someone who was coming in from Constantinople in Turkey to commit a crime against the natural world, to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, to degrade the integrity of the earth by stripping its resources. All of these are sins. And in the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Francis quotes Patriarch Bartholomew extensively. I spoke of the interconnectedness with creation, and we have once again theological themes, all things coming into being through the word, all things in the heavens and on earth being brought together in Christ. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in pain until now. Not only creation, but we ourselves. So these theological themes are often overlooked. We think it only in terms of human beings, but there's an ongoing theme of the whole cosmos connected to this mystery of the incarnation of Christ. Homo sapiens is in an evolutionary framework. It is, although it was kind of resisted by some more, I would say, conservative religious communities, the evidence is so obvious that evolution has reached its kind of level of self-awareness and intentional agency in us, a modern Homo sapiens. And we become kind of conscious. We are conscious of this evolutionary process. The very possibility of creating symbols and using language is a product of this. Terence Deacon at the University of California, Berkeley, has written a book on the symbolic species, speaking of the human being as being fundamentally capable of exercising a symbolic communicative power. And this goes back probably maybe 750,000 to 500,000 years ago. Neanderthal broke off from modern humans, but we discovered there was a lot of interbreeding. We still find evidence of this. And probably it's been maybe 9 to 7 or 8 years that the hominins broke off from what would become modern day chimps, bonobos, probably some of our closest neighbors in the evolutionary tree. So this is reversing the map. It's reading from right to left: Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, Heidelberg, Homo erectus. I do a course here on Christian anthropology, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience to combine the relationships between those fields. Contemporary theology hasn't really engaged that extensively. There's a Center for Theology and Natural Sciences here at the GTU, but to actually engage contemporary contemporary evolutionary theory and neuroscience is critical to understand who we are. It's kind of the missing piece so far in becoming aware of the world we live in. Homo sapiens, because all creatures are created, each must be cherished with love and respect. All of us are dependent on one another, Laudato Si. Neil Gregerson is a theologian, Scandinavian theologian, who speaks of deep incarnation. That is, the word becomes flesh, not just in the body, the biological body of Jesus Christ, but once you enter into that biological body, you're entering into a biosphere. You're entering into sort of a biological network. So he speaks of the deep incarnation of the word, which is not simply taking on one single body, but you're interacting with a network that is very complex and one we're aware of by eating meals and drinking water. We're part of the world we live in. Human beings don't merely draw on, but are part of the ecosystem that facilitates the relationships that give life to our planet. And therefore, it's really critical for us to pay attention to this. But the systems are complex. If you think of the systems, there are social systems, ecological systems, economic systems, and they overlap. That is, we are ecological realities, but we also live in an economic order. That economic order is also a social order. And there are overlapping areas where what is bearable to the question of ecology, what can the ecology bear? There's also the question of what is equitable in terms of distribution of resources for the human race. What is sustainable includes the social dimension. And then at the ecological economic, what is viable? What is conceivable in terms of proceeding forward? Because any plan has to take into account all of these overlapping dimensions of our existence. An ecological spirituality. There's need for an ecological conversion, a new paradigm of justice. We often think of justice, do I owe you something, or do you owe me something, or does it's sort of interpersonal justice. You sign a contract and you rent a house or you rent a room. But what about the justice owed towards the earth itself, or to those who are most directly impacted by climate change, the economical, political, environmental issues? They include spiritual, social, structural conversion. We have to rethink how we relate to one another, to structures, to society. And then there's a symbiotic mutuality and kinship with nature itself versus kind of the paradigm that exists now, kind of greed and exploitation. But this relationship of social and structural conversion, I live in a culture in North America that if you're going to renovate your house or your home, you generally renovate upwards. You make it more complex. You have more features. The next time you buy a phone, the phone is more sophisticated. It's an endless move up the line. And what we're discovering right now, you may have read this, Taiwan, which produces many microchips, is running short of water. But water is an enormous resource for making microchips. So the people in Taipei and throughout Taiwan, this was reported just a couple of days ago, are asked to cut back on their water use so that the microchip production won't be harmed. So this is the relationship between the kind of the technical systems we live in and the impact it has on nature. So if you haven't seen that, you can go to the BBC and you can see a whole story on how the Taiwanese are being asked to cut back on water usage so that they can continue to be a market leader in chip production. Spirituality is really one of stewardship versus domination. There is a requirement for a compassionate respect for the earth. And then I would say something we don't think of very often is lament. How do we lament what has been taking place in the world around us? Some of our students are from Africa, and they will say that their grandfathers, when they went to hunt for food, they would also offer a prayer for the animal that they had just killed. There was a respect for the interrelationship of the wildlife that supported them, but the wildlife's role in the larger ecosystem. We may do that in passing if the community still says grace before meals, but a thought of how an animal has actually been taken out of the biosphere into consumption is often not immediately at our attention. And this has been expressed throughout the ages. John of the Cross, my beloved is the mountains, lonely wooded valley. St. Francis of Assisi, who was modeled for Pope Francis, praised be you, my Lord. That's the way he begins his letter. Laudato si, praised be you with all your creatures. Point 4 is the climate impact on the most vulnerable. A theme which is permeating almost all the Abrahamic religions is an option for the poor. In Hebrew scripture, it's the widow, the orphan, the stranger. In the Gospel of Matthew, we hear the hungry, the homeless, the sick. Right now, Muslims throughout the world are practicing Ramadan, and one of the fundamental pillars of Islam and of Ramadan is almsgiving, care for the poor. So these three Abrahamic traditions have this ongoing care for the least in the society. But then if you look at the map to the left, this is the global flood risk in the next 30 years. The regions that are darkest are the ones that are most likely to suffer serious flooding. And it's very interesting to see how widespread this is. There's the irony of both desertification, where lands become more desert, but at the same time, enormous flooding. And we've seen that in those opening slides that have taken place in the last few years, and even in the last few months here. So the part of it is who is impacted the most, and what responsibility is there for this preferential option for the poor as a moral attitude, as a moral disposition. If you look at a map in disaster-induced displacement, this was a map from 2013. In 2013, there were about 22 million displaced, 22 million human beings displaced by some form of climate disaster. Could be fires, could be flooding, it could be the deserts, it could be typhoons. They'd be connected to climate disasters. That's something like 22 million people, which would be the size of many countries in the world. So part of it is this impact on the most vulnerable. The semi-arid lands of Kenya, I kind of alluded to this in my opening slides, often means that people who are very much dependent on livestock can no longer raise cattle. They just don't have the access for that. And because their livelihoods rely mainly on the livestock, the mortality rates mean that these people become practically the most vulnerable population in Kenya. So that the link between drought risk, vulnerability, and poverty becomes significantly stronger as you see the connection it has in a tertiary way to people whose livestock depend on this. This would also be true. I saw a documentary film just a couple of days ago on, it was on the impact of the killing of the buffalo, which pretty much wiped out a large part of the Indian population when European settlers first moved to the US. Where the interconnectedness of creation, of climate, of the resources for livelihood and people's lives are connected. Intergenerational justice. By 2050, it is estimated that 200 to 300 million people, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, are expected to face forced migration because of climate change. At the present time, the United Nations does not recognize climate migration as something that other countries have to respond to. If there's a genocide, if there's violence, that's one thing. But if you're a refugee of climate, there is not yet a UN responsibility shared by the other countries to address the refugees of climate change. There's an enormous report here, the World Bank Group Report of March 2018 on groundswell, very helpful. The difficulty is the map on the left demonstrates that the per capita emission of the gases that are causing much of the climate change are really on the countries in red. And yet the people who are being most impacted by these, at least in projection to 2050, are those who produce the least per capita, CO2 and other gases. So the impact of the overuse and the gas emissions is impacting those who are least responsible for the problem. I just mentioned that by 2050, maybe 200 to 300 million people will be climate refugees. Well, if you take Greta Thunberg, who was 16, and she will be 46 in 2050. Her generation will be the one that really deals with this enormous shift in population. Obviously, it won't occur overnight. I'm not suggesting that. It's not as if suddenly in 2050, everybody starts moving. But the fact is, when you look at the population in 2020, 25% of the human race is under 14, 15% 15 to 24. So that means that 41% of the human race are under 25 years old. That population will inherit most of the impact of dealing with climate change in a couple decades. Some of us, like myself, will probably be gone, but it doesn't mean that we're not responsible for the intergenerational justice. So I go back to this paradigm I had suggested early on, and kind of the circle of moral discernment, seeing, judging, acting. How do you really see? How do you assess and make sense of the situation in front of you? It's the kind of, we have data at our disposal. How do we make sense of it? In many ways, we would not have had adequate information probably in the year 1950 to really be able to assess the long-term impact of emissions. We would not have had these studies of ice samples. What we can do today is drill down into the ice and pull up a long core and then determine at different ages in the period of the history of the Earth how much CO2 was in the air, how much of this was in the air. We have data now that in 1950 or certainly 1900 we would not really have had. So what we have to do is be critically attentive, assess carefully strategies for response, and then do something. Action, some kind of action is required. There's pretty much unanimous agreement that the first priority is emissions. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Yale Climate Connections, the British Geological Survey, the Union of Concerned Scientists. All of these are pretty much convinced that the problems lie with greenhouse emissions that we generate. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the concentration of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides have increased to unprecedented levels. And the atmosphere's share of carbon dioxide, the planet's chief climate change contributor, has risen by 40% since pre-industrial times. So man-made or anthropogenic component of the greenhouse effect is caused by our activities that emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. One of the most important is the burning of fossil fuels. They contain carbon, and when they are burnt, this carbon combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. Changes in the land use are important because deforestation causes the emission of carbon dioxide. We emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in enormous quantities because we burn so much fuel, and changes in land use that we have implemented, which are so widespread. I had mentioned that studies doing these core samples of ice samples and so on, trying to figure out, can we trace the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide back over the centuries? That was really only possible when you could do that type of sampling that we just didn't know about in 1900 and 1950. But you can see the enormous spike in carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that have taken place probably in the last 200 years, in large part because of the Industrial Revolution. And this is not pointing the finger. This is a question of the factual evidence that we have to deal with. So the question is not giving a guilty conscience, is how do we respond to what we know about the world around us? That's the real issue. The Union of Concerned Scientists say climate solutions: cut emissions, remove carbon dioxide, fight disinformation, a major problem. Anybody connected to a college or university or educational system has a responsibility to maintain the appreciation for truth. Alternate facts are not the truth. Alternate facts are not the truth. Prepare and adapt, and then act. If you look at the carbon dioxide source countries, this blue one down here in the bottom left, the United States, the US per capita contribution, the per capita, per person capita, is 2.4 times that of China, and it's 10 times that of India. So if you take person by person in China, person by person in India, the US generates 2.4 times that per person of people in China and 10 times that of India. The diagram it's really very helpful to study it. It's kind of hard to do online. This is why if you go to the sources or you download the PowerPoint, you can find this information. If you look at the PowerPoint CO2 emissions by country, Saudi Arabia is probably around 15.9 tons per capita. The US about 15.5, China 17.4, Indonesia 2, India maybe 2, Philippines about 1.22. The human sources of carbon dioxide. The largest, maybe 44%, be electricity generation and heating, manufacturing and construction, fuel combustion for other uses, non-road transport, and road transport, cars, trucks, and buses, and then other non-transport operations. So what do we do? Well, there are an endless number of books coming out these days on what could we do. Hope Jaren's really fine book, The Story of More, How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here, is very helpful, listed on the New York Times Book Review back in April. Solomon Goldstein Rose, The 100% Solution, The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. The materials are endless. And if you get the New York Review of Books each Sunday, you'll probably find a wide selection of discussions of the new materials that come out, both in the ads that appear from the publishers, but also in the reviews that are provided by the reviewers themselves. Finally, there's a need for some new economic model. Foreign Affairs in January, February 2020 was asking, is the neoliberal collapse? Markets are really not the answer. And the reasons for this. This is because it's the very dynamic of a market is to produce more, use more, and continue to use more. So there is a suggestion of, for example, Pope Francis had held a international event online because of the pandemic called the Economy of Francisco. He's trying to get younger people, younger economists to begin to think in categories that aren't the traditional categories about how economies can work. Not that people become poor, but that there's a way in which we function without the endless destruction and waste that comes about from this. Development must not aim at the amassing of wealth by a few, but must ensure human rights, personal, social, economic, and political. And then more recently, in October of last year, he issued Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship, an appeal to the global human population about how do we work together no matter what our religious backgrounds, how do we cooperate for the common good on the planet. There are the sessions of this conference listed here: Peace is Tranquility, Changing Homo economicus to Unearthed Human, Divesting from Banks and Accounts that Finance Weapons, Creating Social Business, Tax Havens. And once again, all of these sessions are available at this link if you want to follow it through to look at it. There are also alternate economic models. One would be circular economics. The circular economy is an alternative to a traditional linear economy, make, use, destroy, in which we keep resources in use for as long as possible, extract the maximum value from them while in use, then recover and regenerate products and materials at the end of the cycle. So a linear economy is this on the left-hand column. The resources are mined, production takes place, they're used, and then thrown away. A friend of mine, a Chinese American who was an engineer in New Jersey, he and his wife had bought an apartment, a house to rent to hope to have income to educate their two kids who will be going to college. Both are American citizens now. And he bought a new washing machine, called the appliance when it wasn't working. He says, "Oh, we don't repair those, we throw them away." And he said, "Well, no, I just bought this 2 months ago. I'm not going to throw it away." But that was the attitude of the appliance dealer, is we're not going to repair it, just junk it and we'll get you a new one. But that attitude about not reusing is what generates our enormous quantities of waste. So a circular economy is really to kind of close the loop, closing the loop. I was startled to discover an example of the linear economy. Every year, trips are underway transporting goods from one part of the world to the next. About 700 ships each year are taken out of service because of their age. Many are broken annually, especially along Southeast Asia, polluting the environment, endangering workers in Southeast Asia, and leaving the wrecks you see here. But they're the byproduct of the global trade that takes place in transporting kiwis from Peru to pineapples from Hawaii to San Francisco and so on. And they're left, unfortunately, this is the use and then throw away kind of mentality. There's a great video, The Circular Economy, the Greatest Hits, 7 of the Best Examples. I recommend this video clip from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about how one can think to reuse sources in a very constructive way. There's material on regenerative agriculture. The Regeneration International proposes ways of growing products in such a way that they are susceptible of sustaining further growth and not depleting the resources at hand. So they're able to increase soil carbon levels, and this move to regenerative agriculture is a step in the direction of, instead of wiping out the resources of a block of land for use, you continue to enrich it. Regeneration International is also Cool the Planet, Feed the People. Once again, if you were to, come back here. if you were to click on that central piece, it would open up to their resource. So you might want to look at that. There's just enormous amount of material. And then a wonderful film is Closing the Loop, a documentary about the circular economy revolution. It's available online. I think I found it on, could have been Netflix. I'm trying to remember it, but Closing the Loop, very well, highly praised documentary. Then there's an economist over at University of California, Berkeley, Claire Brown, writing on Buddhist economics, an enlightened approach to the dismal science of economics. A holistic economic approach integrating sustainability, shared prosperity, and compassion in an economic system that provides a comfortable, meaning life for all. She was one of the speakers at our Earth Day teach-in last March. She came over from UCB and was with us all day and gave a very fine presentation, and I stayed in contact with her since then. Her book, Buddhist Economics, is in the library over at Cal, and she's on the faculty still. So back again to this question of seeing, judging, action, and seeing in an imaginative way. Sometimes we have to kind of be jogged out of our traditional ways of seeing things. So I would say there's a question of personal action, lifestyle, patterns of consumption and waste, use of disposable utensils, plastic spoons, plastic forks, throwaway paper, travel patterns, renewed self-awareness, living in solidarity with the rest of the human race. It is said that during the pandemic, weight gain in the United States has averaged 15 pounds. People out of anxiety and restlessness just start eating and consuming, and the average gain is about 15 pounds across the US. Political action. There's really a need to be involved in the political process because that's where the common good is kind of fielded. The common good is really negotiated and discussed in the public field. So it's regulations that protect the environment, support for renewable energy, sustainable urban planning, very important piece, adherence to international environmental accords, and then refuting misinformation on the environment, restoring a culture of truth. Did we start at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock? My apologies, we're already at, this finishes up in about 2 slides. I apologize for.
It's a wonderful presentation.
Take your time, it's wonderful,
Okay.
take your time, you're good.
1/4 to 1/3 of all food produced is lost or wasted. 1/4 to 1/3 of all food produced is lost or wasted. And the share of global food loss and waste by commodity it's kind of hard to see in this map, but it gives you a breakdown of cereals, tubers, fruits, meat, milk, and so on. You can get a breakdown of how much in each segment is lost. The annual food waste by region, you have US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand is this red column. That's the kilograms lost per person wasted. And then we have Europe, China, Japan, and Korea, North Africa, West and Central Asia, down to sub-Saharan Africa in this last column here. This is tongue-in-cheek, I won't stay with it. It's just a question of the assault on climate information. Summary reviews. What prompts attention? Interconnectedness, human beings, rooted in an evolving cosmos, ecological spirituality, climate impact on the vulnerable, intergenerational justice, need for economic models, the circle of discernment, see, judge, act. A possible resource is this ecumenical interreligious guidebook, Care for Our Common Home. And then after a long presentation on disturbingly depressing news, the New York Times reported a few days ago that 300 corporate leaders are asking the Biden administration to nearly double the emission reduction target set by the Obama administration. Imagine businesses asking for a greater emission reduction. Okay, so this appeared in the New York Times just about 5 or 6 days ago. Good, very good news, as a matter of fact. And then, of course, we also heard that a couple days ago that the United States and China, despite all of our other battles, are addressing the climate crisis. And there's a joint statement here about their willingness to kind of strengthen the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, this is a document. It's not yet actually done, but at least it shows some area of cooperation between two superpowers, which are otherwise at odds with each other over so many other areas. So I want to thank you for your attention. I appreciated the opportunity to be with you. I had put the link for this PowerPoint in the chat column. It's about 95 megabytes. So I can't send it to you by email, but you can download it if you want from the web, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful, wonderful and compelling presentation. Sally, do we have any, I mean, can we spend 5 minutes if somebody has a burning question or comment?
Absolutely, we certainly can.
Are you available for that, George?
Not going anywhere.
Great.
I wouldn't anywhere have to put a mask on.
Right. So anyone who really wants to jump in here? Go ahead, Ronald.
It seems, George, we need an environmental Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Obviously, you remember Martin Luther King. We haven't had a public voice like that. I think since Martin Luther King, who could galvanize an entire country about an issue. It cost his life, but he was someone who spoke a prophetic word to a large population and caught their attention.
But in a way, the Pope is being that. I mean, his address, his Laudato Si, was for all human beings. I mean,
what he was hoping is that other religious traditions, I mean, Christians, of course, but also Buddhists and Jews and Muslims, would begin to tackle this together because it's something that cuts across every ethnic, national, gender, religious boundary. Everybody is affected by this. There's nobody who can sort of say, I'm going to escape this on an island somewhere, you know, off of Bangladesh. The other thing I think is it's hard. Changing lifestyle is not easy. I discovered that myself. I have to really intentionally change my lifestyle to cut back on plastics and bottles and so on. That's only a start, but if I network with others, this can sort of engage a kind of a political force. It took, I don't know how many decades for there to be a treaty banning landmines. It took a long time for that. Generations, and now most countries, not the US, have decided to ban landmines. These accomplishments have to be sort of nation, even Princess Diana was involved with that. It's remarkable. But change is a very slow, or for example, the ending of above ground nuclear testing and underground nuclear testing, that took decades to accomplish. The trouble is we don't have decades. The tipping point is very close in terms of the climate, and right now, this year, we are running about 40% of the normal rainfall to date. That is, we are less than half of what we would normally have by this date, and we're pretty much out of the rainy season. So we're going to be up a tree come the summer when it comes to dried forests and dried land.
Marilyn.
I'm wondering if you know, if anybody who is studying disposable, the notion of disposable income, I would love to see a tool that would allow individuals or other groups to evaluate their own situations and what they have that is disposable as a way of opening up alternative use of our disposable wealth. And I'm wondering now, is that just another one of those individual actions like switching to paper straws that doesn't do enough good? Or if if exploring that concept might be a tool that would turn the dial on the clock.
Marilyn, they're called taxes.
Right.
That's where Norway has it
No,
on us. They
right.
tax everybody to the hilt and use it for socially and environmentally just purposes.
Absolutely. That's the way it should be done. Thank you. I agree with you. And on the other hand, I wonder, it probably isn't enough if just a few of us try it. Dorothy Day tried that. Lots of other people tried that. We need a societal, yes, Ron, taxes.
Okay, maybe one more.
One
Okay, go ahead.
one of the problems of, say, having a Martin Luther King of environmentalism, or even any of us just getting really engaged, is that there's some degree of abstract thinking that goes into the immediacy of the problem. And when there's so many other immediate problems that we have around us, and making that connection kind of concrete seems to be one of the big struggles that we have.
I agree. Mhm.
Last year, when I woke up one day and the sky was red and the sun was shining through it like a little orange disc,
Mhm.
I thought, this is the apocalypse. No, I mean, it was really frightening. Now, the problem was life went back to normal about 3 days later.
Yeah,
And the impact of that, which was really startling,
visceral.
visceral, yes, very visceral impact,
Mhm.
evaporated after a while because it just kind of displaced by other crises. But I still remember walking outside and saying, oh my God, it's noon and it looks like it's evening, you know?
Mhm.
There is immediate I had an immediate reaction to the place in scripture where it says that the sun turns red, or the moon turns red.
Mm,
The sun is darkened and the moon turns red.
Mhm.
Right.
I'm
Okay, Sally, are we done here? I don't know what our timetable is, and I don't want to keep.
I was just going to make one comment, and that was just that I'm encouraged by the fact that our young people don't have the same problem, many of them don't, of not being able to isolate this problem as not being distracted by all the other issues. Many of them are very concerned because it is their future. We've heard, Greta is going to be 46. She knows that that generation is, that they're the ones that are going to have to live with the consequences of how we're not focusing on this as a visceral today problem. I look forward to hearing from our young people on Thursday and hope you'll join to hear what they have to say.
I realized I had not sent that link until just now. So that's the link to the PowerPoint. And what it does, it gives you access to other documents that I had embedded in the PowerPoint, but it's not as if you have to save it and put it under your pillow. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, the discussion continues. Roberta, you wanted to say something?
I just think that this was so complete and so impressive. I want to thank you, but I just am thinking about how many places we can get this presentation presented again, because so many people do not know any of this, and the majority of people know so little. I think we have to spread the word in whatever way we can, and your presentation is just practically unbelievable.
you need to train a bunch of us to use the slides.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much.
So I agree and second that, and that's why I had George back a second time.
Thank you. I enjoyed this very much.
Art, did
appreciate-
you want to get a last word in?
Do I?
I thought I saw your hand up. Art.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
No. I mean, I really like what you said, George, at the end about, the questioning of the models and pushing toward a different model. Because I think more and more writing is occurring on this, kind of really looking at, will the consumption-oriented model carry us to a good place? And I think more and more people are feeling like, no, it's just,
Right.
it's damaging the earth, and it ultimately is damaging humanity. So I
Yeah.
think thinking in that toward maybe it's more of a sustainability model. And to me, what's interesting is what would it be like to as a community, maybe as a church? I mean, we're talking about this at Montclair, or as the Berkeley Presbyterian mission homes, to actually start living a little bit more out of a sustainability model as opposed to a consumption-oriented model. What would that look like for a existing community to shift in that direction? And I think that's kind of the edge we're starting to work on. Now, for the global community to do that, that is an immense challenge. But I think there's more and more belief that the economic model we're working off of will ultimately destroy us.
No, I agree with that. I really want to learn more about how to access that circular model that George was talking about.
Yeah, that
That's
might
where
be
we
part
need
of
to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, George.
And thank you, George, so much, so very much. And I know how to reach this man. So if you have other ideas of where he needs to be heard, just reach out.
Sally, what goes on tomorrow?
So tomorrow it's the Laudato Si presentation by Dr. Levi Checkett, who's actually a recent PhD, but teaches at Santa Clara University, Holy Names, and is intimately acquainted with that document. I'm sure it'll be very good. So it's a short way to sort of absorb the content of a pretty lengthy document to read. And since George had mentioned it in his presentation, I felt it would be really good to look at it more closely. So that's tomorrow. And then Thursday are the youth. And then Myung Ho Sim will be on Friday. You want to tell just say in a word what you're going to be sharing on?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was wrestling with the question, why don't we do enough? We have all the science, we have the ethics, we know all that, but why can't we get it done somehow? And I came up with the idea that eventually we have to redefine ourselves. We have to rethink who we are in order to change our behavior. So that's in short.
So that's, by the way, Dr. Myung Ho Sim. Just succeeded in defending his dissertation, which I know it's just a craving to hear more about it.
Yeah,
And then on Saturday, come here and we're going to plant trees and we're going to bless our land and we're going to do a acknowledgement to the Ione people of this land, of where this land came from and to whom it belonged, and start a little garden and be outside in the environment in small groups. Wear your mask, but come and pray and be together.
and have a look at the movie.
Oh
Kiss
yeah,
the Earth.
everyone please see the movie Kiss the Earth. Yes. And then Ron is going to talk about that on Sunday in the Adult Forum of St. John. If you're free, we can send you the bulletin if you're not a part of that community, but he'll be presenting the adult forum and talking a lot more about that film and much more too.
Come join us, and we
Yeah.
look forward to new voices.
For sure. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Heidi, for sort of hosting and
Thank you,
Blessings.
Sally.
blessings to
Thank you,
everyone.
Sally, and thank you, George. It's
Yeah. Thanks, Sally.
really
Thank you, George.
an
Yeah.
amazing time. That's how I feel. Thank you again.